Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our next talk at More to My House. I'm Simon Crompton of Permanent Style. My guest this evening is Luke Walker of the brand LEJ, but also someone who's designed for many brands over the years, both more on the fashion brand side and the more traditional menswear brand side. So I'm quite excited to talk to Luke this evening about how those two things contrast and how the design process works at both kind of types of company. So Luke, let's kick off with that kind of question. Having worked at those two different companies, how does the design process differ from the two?
How does it differ? Okay, so it's yeah. How does it? We rehearsed this, and I can't remember, but you can. So how does it differ in a classic menswear company, which I suppose might be the most familiar to people listening to this? It would probably be a case of going to a supplier or focusing on what kind of product you want to make and saying, right, I want to make a Shetland sweater. So finding somebody who makes Shetland sweaters, going to those guys, saying, what have you got? Looking at what they've got and either taking exactly what they have or manipulating it a little bit. Sleeves shorter, longer, adjusting the neckline, maybe adjusting the rib height. But it's small kind of fractional alterations to something that exists and something which a maker already knows how to make very, very well. And they're very, very comfortable.
Which might make complete sense in that they're a classic company anyway. Right? They're not going to want to try and reinvent something entirely, so they're not going to want to go completely off-piste, because that's kind of probably not their brand and their audience, perhaps.
Yeah, well, maybe not their brand, but that's another interesting thing which we should talk about, is suppliers becoming brands and the way in which particularly within the classic menswear world, the suppliers who would have given classic menswear brands their goods, which are kind of not exactly generic, but quite familiar. Yeah. They are the suppliers want to become more like brands themselves, so it's becoming more difficult for the classic menswear brands who have to buy from those suppliers to compete with the suppliers as well as other brands in the marketplace. So that's an interesting point. But the difference with a fashion company would be that it's more, I guess the vision is just, it's so much more important than the final product, in a sense that you're conveying an image and you're conveying a mood, and you want to, as a designer, you start with a very, very pure concept, and everything has to come from that concept and from almost a blank page. And there's a little bit of reluctance to take something that somebody's already worked on because it's someone else's work.
Okay. Because you're almost like an artist. Why would I just take what someone else has done, whereas I can just conceive of this thing from scratch?
Yeah, and especially because within a fashion world, you're going to be talking about different volumes, different textures, different stitches. If we're talking about knitwear, it's probably not going to be a very, very classic piece that you want. That brand is going to want something quite avant-garde, potentially.
So what could a concept be like that? What kind of vision, do you think of an example, could someone have that then sort of is going to transfer into this piece of knitwear?
I mean, anything from, I don't know, a Dada painting or collage or something like that to a beautiful tree in a desert. It can be very, very abstract, or it can be very, very precise. I want to do a collection based around Helmut Lang in 1993, and they're the volumes that we're going to concentrate on. So it's very difficult to say what it would be.
Sure. No, yeah. But the kind that gives an example of the kind of thing it could be. And I think it's interesting because if you're more a classic menswear consumer and more of a permanent style reader, it's hard to conceive of how that works and how that then translates into clothing if you haven't gone through it. Does that make sense? But so it's interesting to see, to hear about how that kind of process would work. Yeah, and actually could make a kind of piece of clothing that a permanent style reader might actually really like and really appreciate. It doesn't have to be completely wacky or the kind of catwalk stuff that might immediately kind of spring to mind. It could be a really interesting thing with just really nice fabrication or a really interesting cut or something else, right?
And that very much depends on the brand and the designer and how extreme they are in their aesthetic. You might start with 3 super classic sweaters from a very classic brand and decide to chop them all up to adjust the volume and stick them all back together. yeah, that's one way of designing. You know, a lot of designers design the vintage, and that's exactly what they'll do. They'll chop a sleeve off this, use the body of that, a pocket from something else, and make this. That was very much what Catherine Hamlet did in the beginning. You know, she was a genius at taking pockets from different things and putting, you know, this beautiful military pocket on this piece of tailoring, and really playing around with those different.
And where
references.
is she working? Obviously, I know, but you know, everyone else doesn't necessarily know.
Oh, when?
Yeah, and where? Yeah.
When? 80s London. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, Catherine Hammett of the logo, the original logo tees. Life is Sacred. Things like that.
And then some of that design will go into like a catwalk collection. Some will go into clothing, which could still be fairly classic. There would be kind of a store that that a reader might see. I guess one of the things I wanted to kind of explore is trying to explain to some readers how there could be really interesting things there from fashion brands that could broaden the horizon, that could be beautiful in interesting ways, but they don't necessarily, you know, understand or appreciate that because they're put off by kind of fashion as a whole, whether it's the catwalk stuff or the headlines or even the prices or whatever it might be.
I think quite a good illustration of that is possibly you've probably seen The Devil Wears Prada many times, and there's that great scene where Miranda Priestley lectures Anne Hathaway's character. I can't remember her name, but she walks into a room and Anne Hathaway is this very bookish girl, and she kind of sniggers because all the Vogue girls, again, it's not Vogue, it's something else. But you know, all the Vogue girls are being very serious about which belt should go with which sweater, and Hathaway's sniggering away, and then Miranda Priestley gives this big lecture about why Anne Hathaway's wearing that particular sweater, and it's, you know, it's ridiculous, but it's actually very true. The way in which the creative director of a brand, of a house, will have a very catwalk-focused image of what they want to project, but then the house has to commercialize what they're making. So whether it's the certain yarn that they're using in a huge oversized sweater, they'll do a commercialized version which would be more fitted. Okay.
So it could be a more classic piece of knitwear, but actually it'd still be a piece of knitwear which would have a yarn in it that you wouldn't have seen from another brand.
That you wouldn't have seen from another brand, but it would be from the main collection. Yeah. Okay. So most larger houses, some have a lot more now, but the normal is to have 4 collections. You have 2 runways a season, and then you have cruise and resort. So they're normally a little bit safer, and then the main season collections would be the wackier ones, but they'd all reference each other. Okay. So you'd have similar concepts running through, the more extreme versions for the main collection, then it would filter down to the commercial. And is that process still, and those brands still the same as when you kind of first started, or has that changed over time? Because I think the cynical view now would be that's come a bit too commercialized. No one really has that kind of freedom anymore, and it's all driven by lipstick and handbags and everything else. I mean, it's certainly changed. I've been doing this for 20 years, so you know, there's been a lot of inventions which have happened since then, like being able to stream a conversation and social media and things like that, and the way in which brands communicate. So yeah, it's changed, but also I think what's very interesting to think about is that like high-end fashion hasn't been around for that long. When you think about like who the biggest brands in the world are now, like Louis Vuitton, for instance. It's a huge brand, everybody knows who they are, but they've only been doing clothes since, I think, like 97. So that's what, 25, 26 years. So actually, like something that seems like it's been there forever is actually still quite new. So
it's not surprising it's kind of finding its feet.
Yeah, the way in which it's commercialized is evolving.
Yeah.
And you know, these brands, these houses are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they need to fund that in certain ways. So sorry, what was the question?
How's that changed over time? Because I think I remember us saying at one point, like, is so many of those brands, like a creative director only has like 2-3 years before, and if they haven't created like an it bag or something in that season and created a big hit for the brand, then they move on. And so from the outside, you're thinking, oh, these designers are just changing, going from one place to another. So there's no real kind of essence to the brand anymore, no identity there that I'm going to kind of buy into as a consumer.
I guess the urgency to make money is one of the things which has changed. So again, back to the LV example, Marc Jacobs was there for 15 years or something, I can't quite remember, as creative director, which is almost unheard of these days, because people don't get the opportunity to stay in those positions long enough to really prove themselves and to really develop their vision for a house.
Is there anyone else around? Who is there around these days that has still been around that long and had that kind of vision?
Yeah, good question. I guess Alessandro Michele, who just left Gucci, but he was there for 8-9 years, something like that, which is a pretty long stint.
And as a non-fashion consumer, I still have a very strong image of what his Gucci means to me. So, which probably speaks of being there for that long length of time, right? And having been really working that vision and doing it in different ways every single year.
But it's incredibly rare these days, I think, to have a designer in place for that long. Because they've got to prove themselves. They've got to justify the huge spend that the brands allow them.
And that's the thing, is if someone has a big success, the stakes are getting higher and higher, right? Everyone else to meet that kind of success. The only way to do it is to have a big, successful accessory or whatever else, right? There's nowhere else to make that kind of money. So.
So, for instance, when Kim Jones moved from Louis Vuitton to Dior, maybe 5 years ago, I heard he's something like tripled their revenue from 2 billion to 6 billion. And he's a guy who, he's very creative and his shows are amazing, but he knows that you've got to do the it bag, you've got to do the it shoe, and his job is there. His job is to be there and create a beautiful collection, but that collection then has to sell and support everything else and drive the sales into those little entry price pieces and not so entry price pieces, which fund everything else, which fund the empire.
What was the example we were talking about before with Berluti? Someone's period at Berluti we thought was really interesting.
It's Haider Ackermann. I don't know how much people know about the main big luxury fashion houses and who owns them, but most of them are part of 2 or 3 big groups, and a lot of the designers kind of move around within the stable of the conglomerate. And Haider Ackermann is one. He was at Berluti. He was doing very, very beautiful work, but he was kind of moved aside maybe because they had someone else that they had to find a job for, and it was well, who knows what the motivation was, and I wouldn't like to speculate on what the motivation was, but
anyway.
But
what was nice about his work, and what that you liked in that kind of period?
So I guess Berluti isn't very well known for the clothing.
Well, that's why I find it an interesting example. Sorry to interrupt, because I think, again, classic menswear person thinks, Berluti was, okay, maybe not my taste, but an interesting shoe brand, did its thing. Someone comes along, tries to turn it blow it into something much bigger. I'm going to be quite cynical about this. How are they going to create some big identity out of like some writing on a pair of like old leather shoes? But the reason I like your example is because it kind of showed me that there are really interesting things that someone could be doing at a house like that. And you just got to find it when it's there.
And I think sometimes with Berluti, for instance, it's if a house doesn't have so much history behind it, if there's nothing to prove, then you'll almost be allowed as a designer to be more experimental and to project your vision on it, because there's if you haven't done clothes before, then there's nothing to set the bar against. So when Haider was doing it, he was doing it in a more almost like if you look at Valentino Couture now, like he was doing those kind of very beautiful fabrications using silk taffetas for parkas and these real jewel tones in the sportswear, and it wasn't feminine in any way, but he was borrowing a lot of traditionally feminine fabrics and using them in a way which was very clever with volume and the way in which the natural properties of those fabrics could be exploited.
That's what I thought. I think it's very easy in a classic menswear or traditional menswear world to get very set into what things you think, this will last forever, this is the classic cut of that, the classic cut of this. And I love the fact that if you could see someone who's doing something really interesting from a design point of view and just bringing in slightly different colors and different like fabrics, right, and like different volumes, it can really open your eyes to this kind of stuff. But what you don't want to do is go into a store and just see some bunch of bomber jacks with like bomber jackets with like big letters or branding all over them, where you feel like, okay, all they're doing here is just a branding exercise. They're just trying to let people project the fact they're wearing a certain brand.
Yeah.
So, like that period of wearability sounded like, not sure I would necessarily wear any of it, but I'd love to have seen it and kind of experienced it, because I feel like, as somebody who loves beautiful clothes, and I think all permanent style readers, really into those fabrics and cuts and understand this kind of thing in one particular world, to see it in another world would be really, really interesting.
And it does all filter down. So typically, back to the classic menswear manufacturers and suppliers, they'll offer a certain colour card. Let's say back to the knitwear, back to the cashmere. There'll be a seasonal colour card. Now, you'll always have the classics on there, but you'll have a few special bright moments of excitement. And the question is always, where did they come from? Were they just plucked out of thin air, or do they filter down from a beautiful show like Haida Ackerman is doing, and the designer at the knitwear company said, oh, that's a beautiful purple, let's do that for next season's cashmere.
Or even the knitwear company could have worked with the designer
to develop something.
And they go, well, let's pull that colour into what you're
and they put it in 2 seasons later. So it's, even though you might think the two worlds are completely separate, they're actually very intertwined. One of your posts the other day made me think about this. It was
the one about buying fakes.
No, it wasn't that. It was how my styles changed over the years. And you mentioned in the noughties, your suits were slimmer, and I thought, okay, why were they slimmer?
Yeah, I mean, and you would see within a menswear world, you would see lots of trends
that
think driving that, but what you don't see maybe is what's driving those trends of designers doing slim suits as well.
It's a bit chicken and the egg. It's like, were you wearing a slim suit because you were younger, you wanted it slimmer, or the tailors that you were going to, that was just their house style, or was it because Hedi Slimane was at Dior and the new thing was these micro lapels and like super, super skinny drain pipes, and that was the fashion world's influence on your very classic menswear world? And I'd be interested to know exactly who was influencing whom.
Yeah, well, presumably those things would also kind of overlap. One fashion brand might start it, and then other people kind of filter down that world, and at a certain point, another world kind of catches up. And you probably got women's wear as well running in parallel at another stage, which might be influencing it with, at least with colours and kind of other things at the same time, right? Yeah. So it must be so hard to kind of to pick apart. Although, I mean, trend forecasters do that these days, but it seems so complex how those things could interrelate to each other.
Yeah, but also very very plain in a way, because the catwalk trends do filter down to every part of clothing, to the high street, to tailors. I mean, do you feel like you're wearing wider lapels at the moment?
Yeah, but I would certainly. I think I would, and a lot of people would almost be slightly upset if they thought I was coming from the fashion world and they've been told what to do because of that. But
it's not dictatorial. It's not saying you've got to wear a wider lapel because it's cool. It's just, I think what fashion does is to completely refresh the eye. Like Diana Vreeland said, the eye has to travel. And we always, as humans, we just want to see new things all the time. That's why we want to paint the walls a different colour, or hang a new picture in a new spot. We just we like our brains to be stimulated, and that goes for all of the creative arts, I think.
And I think a lot of people who were very into clothes would like to think they have their own opinion and their own style, but they see a certain set of images on their friends, on the people on the streets around them, the place they live in, on the shop windows, on the social media that they look at, and that's kind of that. Sometimes I find it hard to explain to people that how much that obviously influenced everything around you, because that's your entire context. If you had no context at all, what on earth would you wear? If you had seen no clothes before, so it's all what you've seen before, and you reacting against that, and picking some bits of it and not doing other bits of it.
Yeah, and either wanting to be involved or wanting to move away, which I guess is the fashion reaction, is to do the opposite. And is the classic reaction to want to be involved, want to embrace it?
Yeah, part of something. It's appealing because you feel you're part of some tradition that feels like more solid and more stable, and this isn't going to change in 2 years. I can carry on doing this for 10 years, and sometimes people get carried away and think they're going to do it for 50 years. It's actually only 10 or 20, but that's still better than 1 or 2. There are trends there, but at least they're kind of longer term trends. And in 20 years, I probably need a new suit anyway, so it's fine if the lapels are wide by that point. It's not the end of the world, And how did that? because you went to St Martin's, didn't you? You studied fashion at St Martin's. So how much of that starts from that kind of fashion school background? Are you being told like every term come up with a concept that gets translated into clothes, or are you just doing like one garment and then trying to pick it apart technically, or how's that kind of stuff structured that everyone's doing?
So St Martin's isn't really a technical school. It's more stimulating the mind and preparing you for industry and the speed at which you need to think.
Okay.
Because as a junior designer, or any designer working under a creative director, or even a creative director having to respond to a CEO or an MD, you can present something to your boss, but if they don't like it, you've got to think of something else like that. Right. So we would be doing maybe 3 or 4 projects in parallel at the same time, all different creative projects. And
a creative project is a particular item, a garment? Or?
It would be, it could be a single garment, it could be a collection of garments, it could be something completely unrelated to fashion, so it could be a sculpture or some kind of mechanism, or just something to be made to solve a problem or to respond to a brief. But you'd have critiques throughout the maybe 4 to 6 weeks that those briefs would run on for, and sometimes the tutors would say, no, scrap it all, start again, and you'd have to do that, and you'd have to do it overnight. And it's a real preparation for what you're going to experience in industry.
You must feel so precious about this thing you've come up, this artistic creation you've come up with.
Well, that's what they
teach. You
teach.
have to just scratch it and do it all again.
I think that's one of the first things about art school. Within any discipline, you can't be precious, because people will always judge what you're doing, and the haters will always speak louder. So you got to not be precious.
And at least I guess in that situation you're by definition learning, or meant to be learning. So you're meant to be open to taking criticism from tutors or whatever else, that this could be scrapped and they'd start all over again.
Yeah, but as most late teen and early 20-year-olds are, there's a lot of arrogance floating around.
And so how was that when you first started working then in fashion? Did reality kind of hit you like a freight train?
No, not at all. No, I went into like pure fantasy world. It was like my first job in Paris. It was basically like being at college, but with thousands of pounds to play with, because there was this huge budget and our
Which brand was that?
That was at Lanvin.
Okay.
Back in 2005, I think. So it was at a period of huge creativity there. Albert Elbaz had been there for 2 or 3 years and been doing some really amazing things, completely turned the brand around from being quite a fusty old, is where all the French politicians would go to have their suits made. Okay. And he came in and started doing these beautiful dresses, absolutely stunning dresses, which would they'd almost just have a single seam, so that it was all about the fabrication. You'd have this.
So fabrication, it means fabric.
Sorry,
yes.
No,
it's fine, because I made that mistake before.
No, it's
the fabric.
It's the fabric.
Okay.
So the cloth, these stunning fabrics, like a silk duchesse or a really amazing triple face cashmere, or these bonkers things, and he just
What's triple face cashmere?
Well, I don't even know.
Okay.
But he'd invent it.
Okay.
And he'd just chop them out with a pair of scissors, and there'd be threads running everywhere, and do like a big chunky stitch up the back, and that would be it.
And with this menswear as well, what was the menswear like?
Well, it was similar.
Okay.
But I guess
I can imagine with
Yeah.
I feel like a dress I can get my head around more, because it feels like a blank slate. You could create anything in this silhouette around somebody. But menswear is much, much harder to do something that original, isn't it?
Well, yeah, certainly, because men also are less open to different things. We've got a uniform, right? And it hasn't changed for centuries. But we were trying to do things in a different way. So things as simple as doing a tailored suit, but we do it in a really light crepe de chine or something like that, and then wash it and stick a big flower on it. And it would be completely different to what those French overweight old politicians were coming in to buy, and they'd all be horrified. Why wouldn't they? But it was a wonderful moment of creativity, because and that's what I mean about the budget and being at school. We were expected to do just anything that our minds could come up with, and the budgets were kind of limitless. So it was going into my first job, I was very, very spoiled in having a very, very creative and nurturing atmosphere to just, go bonkers.
So then what brought you down to earth?
It got too bonkers. I couldn't relate to it anymore. I think that the pressure within fashion is to always create something new and create a new image. And I was there for 6 or 7 years, and in the end, I think it was we may have been guilty of designing things for the sake of creating newness, because that became the pressure. In the beginning, it was reinventing a brand, and it was done in a very, very beautiful way. But then you've got to keep the machine rolling, and you've got to satisfy those hungry mouths and offer them something new every season. When maybe what you've done already is so beautiful, you don't need to reinvent it. But
which again is from the outside what you think of, is just see fashion as been doing the whole time.
It's one of the negatives. It doesn't always happen, but it often does.
Is there anything you can think of from that period, almost that you've kept or that you particularly loved, that still feels like very wearable, that was kind of beautiful in that less outrageous way?
The first few collections where everything was just silk.
Everything was silk?
Everything, more or less everything was silk, wash silk. And it was all, what I have actually is this beautiful velvet jacket. And it's this stunning Japanese velvet, which, I don't know if you know how velvet's woven, but it's similar to corduroy. And the pile is usually cut by a machine, but this particular velvet is from Japan, and there's this one old man, and he would cut the pile of the velvet with a little razor blade by hand. And, I mean, imagine the price. It was exceptional. And he's dead now, so you can't get it.
But more expensive.
But that, I mean, it's just so. I mean, Japanese fabrics are famous anyway for their density and the quality and everything about it. It's amazing. But that in particular, I think, is a.
And you still have a piece?
I still have it. Yeah.
See, that sounds. That again, I don't know. I keep on saying this, but that isn't a thing that I think a permanent style reader would, and a lot of them would really identify with if they really love fabrics, because they're into cord and they like always thinking about what wale of cord do I want and in what colour and in what what's it going to go with. So they're thinking about all these kind of things anyway, but then often can kind of dismiss fashion, thinking like, well, that's just it's too overpriced and it's not for me and it's just all over the top. But there's something really interesting there and beautiful things there a lot of the time.
Yeah, and fashion houses fall into different categories. There are some which are there just to create and reinvent and change every season, but there are other brands which do very valuable artistic work, and others which do very, very classic things, but they manage to change them just enough every season, just to refresh them a little bit.
So who falls into that last category, do you think?
So I think someone like a brand like the Row, for instance, does very, very beautiful things, very luxurious things. It's, if you don't know, it's the Olsen Twins brand, which you might scoff at and think, the Olsen Twins, they've got a brand? It's crazy, but they've got the capital to put into it, to invest in it, to buy the fabrics. Very, very nice fabrics. And there's a very simple aesthetic to it. It's a little bit Celine, it's a little bit Phoebe Philo. It's got that very Jill, kind of modernist purity to it. So I think they do it very well.
Yeah, because I can imagine, like, again, a reader goes into something like that and they go, well, all these pieces look similar to stuff I already have. Whether it's a black bomber jacket or a pair of wool trousers or whatever, but it's twice the price of what going everywhere else. And obviously there's lots and lots of costs that go into that, but one of the costs definitely is a lot more design work and time that's gone into that, right? Than a classic menswear brand kind of would have done. Whether you care about that or not is completely up to you, but that is one thing you're getting from someone like that. Yeah, I like going into those kind of shops because there's always going to be one thing in there which I find really surprising and really interesting, which would be a fabric or a cut or some kind of detail, which is really interesting. And I think a lot of people could learn from pushing sometimes that kind of thing and value that kind of design side of it a little bit more. And
I think that's the point. It's experimenting and using fabrics or shapes or silhouettes or garment categories in slightly surprising ways, which a classic manufacturer wouldn't necessarily do. So it's just recontextualizing a little bit, and through doing that you can get some real moments of beauty.
Because if you go to the manufacturer, like we were talking about at the very start,
they're
never going to suggest these things to you because it's completely unknown to them. They have no idea how the fabrics are going to react to being made. It seems completely too risky.
You need to be a little bit provocative with the manufacturer. I guess it's almost like the difference between a traditional builder building in a very traditional way, and you might have the most beautiful stonework on your walls, but they're only ever going to do straight walls because they stand up. And then
I hate walls that stand up.
And yeah, I know. Crazy.
So boring.
But then an architect comes along, and they're like, oh, "I love what you're doing. It's so beautiful. They're the best straight walls I've ever seen in my life. Have you tried doing them? I don't know, wonky." And the builder's like, "Are you crazy? We don't do it that way." But it's that same sentiment. It's kind of like King Charles, God save the King. It's kind of like his approach. He hates modern architecture, right?
Yeah.
And he likes it all to be very traditional. But don't we all in this room appreciate good architecture?
Yeah, there'd be no architecture at all if there were not someone doing something different with the same traditional materials and techniques.
And I think you can draw a lot of parallels between design, manufacture, and architecture and building, and traditional ways of building.
Yeah.
Which are very time intensive and very beautiful. But what I think a good designer is to take those skills, the skills of the manufacturer, the traditional skills, the beautiful stitch work or handwork or whatever it might be, and apply them in different ways. And you're keeping that trade. It's a little bit like what Grace Wales Bonner does. She does a lot of her tailoring with Anderson and Shepherd, which everyone knows. But she pushes them to do slightly other things. Now they probably don't need her there to support them because they're one of the people who are up there.
That's a very good example, though.
But she's she's a designer who doesn't just do classic stuff. She does quite reasonably crazy stuff sometimes, especially with a traditional maker.
Yeah, and it'd be easy to think that they didn't completely understand and completely respect the manufacturer, how it's done, because they're trying to do something different with it. But actually, it can be exactly that. That's why they're working with that house or factory or whatever it is, because they understand everything that they do, but they just want to try and do something different with it that fits with more there. Yeah.
And I think sometimes makers can be, and manufacturers, they can be very excited about new projects. Sometimes they can be very reluctant, but other times they like the challenge because it's, especially if they're a bit smaller, because they want to break from the norm. They want to exercise their minds as well and solve problems.
And so how does that, like tracing the history then, how does that experience then play into working with more traditional menswear companies like Dunhill and Drake's, and then your own brand? What are those fashion elements you're bringing through?
So it depends on the company, depends on the size of the company. With a company like Dunhill, for instance, when we were working on the menswear there, I think it had fallen into the routine of just selling navy blazers and dark suits, and that's fine. But you've got to remind people that you're there, I think, and only through send it. I mean, we sent boys down the runway in these beautiful, really beautiful pajamas and like a big Kate Moss style alpaca coat, and the boss hated it because it wasn't super classic. It wasn't super masculine.
But those clothes don't sound that scary though either. They're not the weirdest. It's not high fashion.
No, really. No. It was all about, again. It's about context. It's the way in which you put things together. But you've got to agitate a little bit, because only through doing that do people then think, oh yeah, I'll go and get my navy blazer from there because they've got some beautiful things.
They've got a view. They've got a voice.
Yeah. And it's basically visual merchandising on a grander scale, right? You put the big lime green wallet in the window, and then you go inside and buy the brown one.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what a fashion show is, and what businesses need to attract customers. So that's one side of it. Dunhill's a huge company, huge business, lots of doors. But then with another approach with Drake's, for instance, when we started, when we set up the ready to wear there, it was, very much in the classic menswear model, and Michael and I spoke about it, and he wanted to bring in a bit of, he basically wanted uniqueness within the offering, because I mean, I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I guess he saw that there are other houses within the classic menswear landscape, and the offering's reasonably similar, and he had a very clear vision of wanting to do let's say, slightly more exciting pieces. So that wasn't really like a Dunhill type case where you're attracting new people. It's just making new stuff, making unique stuff, making pieces that you can say, right, this is the Drake's Games blazer. We own this. This is absolutely ours. Nobody else does this.
Yeah.
And it's still very classic menswear. Any person in this room can throw it on and be completely comfortable, but nobody else offers it in quite the same way. Maybe they do now because like your copy article, it filters down.
Well, I think this interesting thing is that I think the Games blazer is a very good example because it's not some of the, say, brighter colours and the things that Drake's kind of got then known for. I really love it, but it's all about very small details in that. Things like the kind of the sliding yoke at the back and the way the seams are all done, and the fabrics that are kind of chosen for all of it are wonderful. And multiple times on the site I get the question, I really like the Drake's Games blazer, where can I get it but cheaper?
Right, okay.
And the answer is, well, you can get a corduroy like chore coat somewhere else cheaper, certainly, but it's never going to be quite the same as that.
Yeah.
And the reason it's not the same as that is because the design work that's gone into it.
Yeah.
And I think when people have those very relatable examples, I tried that on and it just looked better. There was something about it just felt really nice. Yeah, that's because someone spent hours and hours and hours and hours and multiple prototypes trying to make that better and more interesting, and that's why it looks like that.
Yeah. And the great thing about the Games blazer and the details you mentioned, like the yoke on the back and various other things, that's a great example of a piece which was led very much by the brief, and very much by the way in which it needed to function. So Michael likes to wash everything. Everything goes in the machine.
Okay.
So we needed a blazer which fulfilled the role of a jacket.
Yeah. You could spill crap on and get put in the machine.
But yeah, he washes everything on 60 degrees, and so it had to have all of these elements to it. So hence the reinforcements in the shoulder, or the slight little bit of there's no canvas in there.
In it as well.
Completely unlined. But you've probably experienced with a butterfly lining. Sometimes it rides up, and you get little lumps in the back.
Which you're never going to press out yourself.
Yeah, so we stitched it down. So there are some little details which sometimes come from construction, and the function of the piece, and details which come from just an aesthetic point of view. Like lapel width. Yeah. Which to a degree it's aesthetic, but with the Games blazer it's because it's got a button at the gorge, so you can close it, and that dictates the size and the pitch of the gorge line and the collar and the lapel width and things like that. So it's that's a very interesting study in kind of engineering and design coming together and creating something quite useful and quite attractive.
Yeah, I think that buttoning of the collar or like the lapel on the gorge line is really interesting because, again, if you're a bespoke customer, you often experience the design side by trying to become a designer yourself. You say, but you talk to your tailor, I want to do this and this, and have you ever done this? And like you start playing around, and you quickly realise quite how hard it is. And then I remember years ago having a tweed jacket that kind of buttoned up, and then the tailor tried to explain to me how you couldn't actually button that up because the curve of the lapels meant that they weren't going to be the right shape. And you just don't think it's that complicated. No, I just want them to just button across. Why can't I do that? Yeah. And then he makes it with like a straight lapel, so it does, and then it looks completely different when you fold it down. It's like, that looks rubbish. It's like, no, it looks rubbish. Yeah. So some people have some experience with that design, which I think is interesting. So then last stage, LEJ, your brand. How long? 2 years has it been going?
3 years. 3 years. Yeah. April 2020 it launched.
And that feels somewhere, to my very much layman's eye, slightly in between, in that it's not very classic. There's some of the more interesting and fabrics there you get at a normal classic menswear brand, right? But it's also not fashion.
I think it's a complete mix of my experience. So from the very, very fashion beginnings, that Parisian mentality of borrowing a lot from women's wear. I use a lot of silks. I use a lot of very lightweight, transparent fabrics and things like that. But creating them in quite easy, relatable men's pieces, elements
sneak it in when they're not expecting it. Sneak it in with to give them the confidence they can wear this thing. But then this isn't actually very kind of lightweight material. I didn't realise, or some kind of detail. I think that's great if you could convince people to just step that little bit outside their comfort zone. I never looked at like leopard print that way before, but now actually I quite like it. And I have tried it.
Leopard prints are neutral. It's nature's camouflage.
It goes with everything.
It
or
does.
Nothing.
It does. It does. Yeah, but that's how I approach it. It's all throughout my design career, anything that's wacky in terms of volume or I mean, there's not been a new men's garment since, what is it, famously since the waistcoat, and Charles II dictated that in 1670 or something like that. And we've been wearing the same, basically, trousers and jackets ever since. So, they change in volume, they change in fabric, they change in colour. And that's, I think that's the job of a designer, just to read the zeitgeist, the mood of the world, and say, okay, we're all feeling a little bit looser, or we all want to be a bit more relaxed, or we all want a bit of luxury because we need to, take care of ourselves first, or whatever it is.
But then mix that with your own personality, so that creates something kind of different. And I like the idea. It makes sense to me, knowing to the extent I do, that you'd be attracted by a lot of wacky things as well. But then they're kind of like filtered down into menswear that even someone like me, would wear and find really interesting, and go, oh, actually, would I wear that? And that's interesting. I've never had that, never looked at that colour before, or whatever else.
Yeah. And I think with all menswear, it's the craziness comes from the styling. It's the juxtaposition of different pieces together, and I think that's menswear designers are really stylists as well, because that's when you get the fun.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And that's why I love the piece that we did with Manish and Andre about how they wore the clothes. Yeah. Because I think you could wear it in so many different ways. Yeah. You could wear your silk shirt, with a suit like I'm wearing, or you could wear like you're wearing, or it could be something like much wackier, depending on how you want to. Yeah. I guess that's quite hard as a brand, though. You can't show every single way to wear it. You have to have sort of a clearer vision than that, don't you?
I mean, you can represent the way in which. Okay, so what I do with LEJ is I represent. It's very much an extension of me, right? It's how I would wear it. But I think with anything, you don't want to be dictatorial. You don't want to say you've got to wear it this way. This is the only way in which it can be worn. It's basically shirts, and you can wear a shirt and you do what you like with it. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter. So I have a lot of people saying to me, how should I wear this? What should I wear this with? Yeah. And I can give suggestions, but really I want to see what I find exciting and actually quite inspirational is to see the way in which different guys wear the same garment. And that also informs the design process, because then you see something that you didn't see before and you think, I didn't think of that. Maybe I should incorporate that detail or that consideration into the next evolution of it. So it's it's a service industry, right? Nobody needs it. So if it's not comfortable, if it isn't easy to slot into the existing wardrobe, then it's not exactly that there's no point in doing it. But with a brand like LEJ, which is really about very, very, very beautiful and luxurious basics, it's not too ultra, it's not too out there, it's not too avant-garde. Yeah. That comes from the styling and the attitude and the personality, which we try and represent through the photo shoots and other things. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we've traced pretty much everything there without doing the kind of very standard, then what did you do next? I think explored everything that's influenced you. So thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
Thanks, Simon.
We normally have some questions from the audience now, if you can handle that.
Yeah.
Do we have we don't have a roving mic. Okay, in that case, can people shout their questions or at least say them very loudly so that we can pick them up? Do you have any questions from the audience? Yes, Lucas.
I'd love to know, I don't know if these will be the same or not, but I'd love to know what your favourite period of fashion that you look at and like the designer that you kind of look at, but then also really, really interested to know where you end up mood boarding and referencing for LEJ, and if they're the same or if they're different, because obviously you could like in an abstract way. Yeah. And I'd love to know like kind of what your sort of brand references are for LEJ, if you have any or anything like that.
Well, they're obviously secret.
Yeah.
You know what? It's a very interesting question. It's something that I've got to relearn in a way, because I work predominantly on my own. I haven't had to externalize the mood boards for quite a long time. If you're working in a company or as a consultant, obviously you have to provide that material for other people to view and to share. But for my own project, it's all in here. Yeah. And I don't have to really share it with anyone, which is great. but it also makes me very selfish and private, right? So so how do I mood board? It's like I use very little visual stimulus. I get quite excited about reading descriptions of things. So I think one of my favorites, I think Manish quoted it, is and it's where like, the first shirt that I did came from, the silk shirt, and it's a description of James Bond wearing it in one of the novels. Manish probably remembers, I don't, I always get it wrong. But it's a great description, and it's like, I mean, Alfie and I were having this conversation the other day about the beautiful thing about reading something and imagining it, and then the disturbing factor of maybe seeing someone else's representation in film of a novel that you've already played out in your head, and it's completely different.
It never looks right.
Yeah, it never looks right because it's not how you imagined it. But that's kind of how I do a lot of the design work for LEJ. I read something, or there's like a kernel of an idea, and it's very, very rarely clothes. Actually, it's often something else. It's often some scenario, or sitting in a certain restaurant on a beachfront somewhere and thinking, yeah, what's the perfect outfit to be here? And it's not, and it'll be a picture of the beach. That'll be the stimulus. That'll be the inspiration, not necessarily the loads of pictures of stripy shirts. So yeah, hopefully that kind of plugs a hole. Cheers.
Any other questions? Yes.
Got lower the tone slightly and ask a question about chest hair. To expand on that, I think it's very clear from your art direction that like sexiness is something in your imaging or how you think about the brand. There's a lot of physicality. You take photos of models, which is very different. Like I think fashion world very comfortable with that, whereas the menswear world maybe less so. So I'm interested in your reflections on whether that's like parts of you deliberately push, and is that something you're aware of how that might divide your audience, or are you just kind of happy to let it all hang out?
Well, yeah, clearly, personally, I'm happy to let it all hang out. Look, I'm very aware that certain, like if you show too much, if you're too provocative, I guess you can turn some people off because it becomes too sexy, or you look at it and you think, oh well, I'm too overweight to wear my shirt like that, or some other reason for not being able to relate to that image. So I'm very aware that it can either turn on or turn off. It is a very deliberate thing, and I think again it's back to this point that there are a lot of people doing reasonably similar things in terms of like a shirt's a shirt, right? Albeit mine, I do mine with different pockets and different stitchings and different fabrics, and I try and make that quite alluring and sensual, and the silks are inherently that. But I also want to represent it in a different way and say, look, yeah, you could possibly categorize it as a classic menswear brand because of the shapes and the forms and the way in which it's made, beautiful stitching and stuff like that. But I want to show it in a different light. I want it to be represented in a more casual, looser, more dressed down way. And also because I want it to appeal to more than just men. A lot of women wear it as well. It's I don't know exactly what the split is, but a lot of women wear it because it's not so buttoned up, and it's not so uptight, and it's not so formal, and it's a bit broken down, a bit looser. And that involves chest hair. Yeah.
No questions? Very good questions so far. Anything else? I'll just ask one more, if I could.
Yeah.
How important do you think it is for like a brand to spend money on like lookbooks and models and styling those pieces? Because I think often if you're into a traditional brand, you think, well, why on earth, I don't want to see all this kind of stuff, or someone spending X amount on lookbooks and shoots and everything else. It's just a sweater. I just want a sweater. Do you think it's that same point of recontextualizing the clothes so people look at it differently?
It's that. It's the change in the way in which we shop. As people shop more and more online, so without an attractive picture, how do you communicate what you're selling?
Yeah. Okay.
That can be a very stock setup. You know, white background, model standing straight, just wearing the garment. That's fine. But I think that if you're going to invest in something and connect with a brand, then you want to understand a bit of the personality. I think without being in a room with the designer or the design team or the PR or whoever it is, then the easiest way to communicate that is through lookbooks. So I think they're absolutely vital as an outlet.
Yeah, because in a store there'd be so much else going on. There'd be music and scent and layout and and merchandising and so much else.
Yeah.
And all you've got is just like.
And even on a website, how many people read through the descriptions?
Yeah. Your description's great, by the way.
Thank you. We're quite lazy. We just want to be told what it is, and we're lazy, but we're very intelligent. Because you see an image and you immediately know what context it is that you're looking at. You get the vibe.
You make an assessment.
You get the reference. Whether or not you know what the reference is, the associations are formed pretty rapidly. So it's just a quick, easy way to communicate. And I think it's also a great way to explore what your brand is and how and demonstrate the ways in which you'd like it to be worn or you'd like to communicate.
So even if the piece of clothing isn't that extraordinary or different to anything else, it could still make someone think about their own clothing in a different way.
It's all styling.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
Oh, we have a question. Yes, Andre.
If you could be more provocative, what would you do? What would your lime green wallet be?
Wait for the next shoot. There's lots of body oil. Will you model?
I don't have any chest hair.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much to Luke for giving his time and
Thanks, Simon.
answering all of our inane questions. It was really, really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you.